She was worshipped as the Queen of Pinup, the Dark Angel, and the ultimate symbol of American desire. Yet while the world made millions off her image, she spent her prime years locked behind the steel doors of a hospital for the criminally insane, penniless, forgotten, and reduced to a mere case number. Her name, Bettie Page. How did the woman who liberated a nation with her smile end up imprisoned by the demons inside her own mind? That shattering was inevitable. Bettie Page was crushed between two worlds that could never be reconciled. The glittering America of the roaring 20s that she missed by a heartbeat, and the hardscrabble, unforgiving South that was waiting to claim her. Nashville, specifically, was a city of church steeples and smoke, a place where religion was the law and poverty was the sentence. Bettie was the second child of Walter Roy Page and Edna Mae Purtle, a couple whose union was forged in the desperation of the working class. From the moment she took her first breath, the odds were stacked against her. The Great Depression was looming on the horizon, a catastrophe that would turn the merely poor into the destitute. But the Page household was already collapsing under its own weight. Her father, Walter Roy Page, was a figure of terrifying contradictions. To the outside world, he could be charming, a man who could talk his way into or out of anything. But inside the thin walls of their cramped home, he was a tyrant. He was a man consumed by frustration and a lack of opportunity, and he channeled that rage into the domestic sphere. But the true horror of Bettie's childhood wasn't just the lack of food or the secondhand clothes. It was the distinct lack of safety. A home is supposed to be a fortress for a child, but for Bettie, it was a minefield. The economic collapse of the 1930s hit the family with the force of a sledgehammer. Walter, unable to provide and unwilling to shoulder the burden of a large family, largely abdicated his responsibilities. The burden fell on Edna Mae, a woman worn down by childbirth and hard labor. She was a hairdresser by trade, washing and styling hair for pennies, trying to feed a growing brood of hungry children. The pressure was unsustainable. In 1933, when Bettie was just 10 years old, the family structure finally snapped. Her parents divorced, a scandalous event in the conservative South of the 1930s, and the fallout was immediate and devastating. Edna Mae, overwhelmed and unable to feed her children, made a decision that would haunt Bettie for the rest of her life. She placed Bettie and her sisters into a Protestant orphanage. For a year, Bettie lived as a ward of the state. While it was not a Dickensian dungeon, the psychological impact of this abandonment was profound. In the mind of a 10-year-old girl, the equation was simple. She was not worth keeping. She was disposable. The orphanage taught her a brutal lesson about self-reliance. She learned that adults were unreliable, that love was conditional, and that the only person who would look out for Bettie Page was Bettie Page. When she eventually returned to her mother's care, the reunion was not the happy ending one might expect. It was merely a transition from one form of neglect to a far more sinister form of trauma. It was during these teenage years, as her body began to change and develop, that the true darkness of her life took shape. Her father, Walter, who drifted in and out of their lives, began to view his daughter not as a child to be protected, but as an object. The details are harrowing and were suppressed by Bettie for decades, buried under layers of shame and denial. Starting around the age of 13, Walter Roy Page began to harm his daughter. It was an ultimate betrayal, a corruption of the most sacred bond between parent and child. In the cramped conditions of their poverty, there was nowhere to hide. This trauma continued for years. It shattered her understanding of boundaries, of love, and of her own worth. It planted a seed of confusion about who she really was, growing into a massive, tangled vine throughout her adult life. Psychologically, this trauma created a fissure in her identity. To survive, Betty had to dissociate. She had to separate her mind from her body. Her body became something that happened to her, something that others used, something that could be bartered or displayed, but not something that truly belonged to her. This dissociation is perhaps the key to understanding her future career. When she later posed for the camera, stripped bare or bound in ropes, she often described feeling as if she were playing a character. She wasn't Bettie Page, the victim. She was Bettie Page, the untouchable image. The camera gave her control over the gaze that her father had stolen from her. Despite the horror at home, or perhaps because of it, Betty became a master of camouflage. Outside the house, she was not the victim of incest or the poor girl from the broken home. She was the star. She threw herself into academics with a ferocity that stunned her teachers. She treated school as her escape hatch. If she could just be smart enough, perfect enough, maybe she could outrun her biography. At Hume-Fogg High School, Betty was nothing short of a phenomenon. She was the salutatorian of her graduating class. She was voted most likely to succeed. She was the editor of the school newspaper, the treasurer of the student council, and the captain of the drama club. She was popular, vibrant, and seemingly overflowing with confidence. It was a dazzling performance. She constructed a persona of the all-American girl, wholesome, intelligent, and ambitious. She wanted to be a teacher, a writer, an actress. She wanted to be anything but what she was. This period of her life highlights the tragedy of her lost potential. Bettie Page was not just a pretty face. She was intellectually gifted. She attended Peabody College, a prestigious institution for teachers, and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1944. Imagine the fortitude it took for a woman of her background in that era to put herself through college. She paid her own way, scrubbing floors and working menial jobs, driven by a desperate need to ascend into the middle class. She did everything right. She followed the rules. She got the degree. She was supposed to become Mrs. Page, the English teacher, living a quiet life in the suburbs with a white picket fence. But trauma does not vanish just because you get a diploma. The chaos inside her was looking for a way out. While she excelled academically, she also began to exhibit a restlessness, a manic energy that drew her toward danger. She found herself attracted to the theater, to the stage, to the idea of becoming someone else. Acting was safe. Acting allowed you to scream and cry and rage, and people would applaud you for it. It was a socially acceptable outlet for the storm raging in her brain. It was during this time, in the early 1940s, that she made her first catastrophic attempt at escape through romance. She met Billy Neal, a young man who seemed to offer a ticket out of her stifling home life. They married in 1943. Right before he shipped off to serve in World War II. It was a wartime romance, hasty and ill-conceived, built on the fantasy of heroism and stability. But when Billy returned from the war, the fantasy dissolved into a nightmare. The man who came back was not the boy she married. He was possibly suffering from what we now know as PTSD. But in the 1940s, there was no language for such things. He was volatile, controlling, and abusive. Betty had fled the frying pan of her father's house, only to land in the fire of a violent marriage. The pattern had repeated itself. She had sought a protector and found another predator. They traveled around living a bohemian, unstable existence from San Francisco to Haiti. It was in Haiti that Betty first experienced a culture that was far less inhibited, more open to the body and the sun. It was a brief taste of freedom, but it was overshadowed by the disintegration of her marriage. By 1947, Betty had had enough. She filed for divorce. In the 1940s, a divorced woman was often viewed as the damaged goods, a failure. But for Betty, it was an act of survival. She was 24 years old, educated, beautiful, and completely adrift. The teaching career she had trained for didn't fit. She tried it briefly, but she lacked the patience and the authoritarian demeanor required to control a classroom. She felt like an imposter in the world of respectability. She needed to disappear and reinvent herself. She needed a place where a girl with a dark past could get lost in the crowd. And so she did what all the dreamers, the broken and the beautiful, did in 1947. She packed her meager belongings. She scraped together her last few dollars. She bought a ticket to New York City. New York in 1947 was the center of the universe. It was a city of jazz, of noir, of post-war optimism and grinding ambition. For Betty, it was a terrifying and exhilarating labyrinth. She arrived with dreams of becoming an actress, of seeing her name on a Broadway marquee. But the reality of New York was harsh. She moved into a tiny room at the YWCA, living among other aspiring girls who were all chasing the same impossible dream. She worked as a secretary, struggling to make ends meet, her teaching degree gathering dust. It seemed for a while that Bettie Page would be just another anonymous face in the city, another pretty girl who tried and failed. But fate, as it often does in these stories, intervened in the most mundane way possible. One afternoon in 1950, Betty was walking along the shoreline of Coney Island. She had taken a day off to escape the heat of the city. She was wearing a homemade bikini. She had learned to sew out of necessity during the Depression, and her creations were often more daring and fitted than anything you could buy in a store. She was walking through the sand, the wind in her hair, eating a hot dog, when a man approached her. His name was Jerry Tibbs. He was a police officer, but his passion was photography. He was a member of one of the many camera clubs that were popular at the time, groups of amateur photographers who pooled their money to hire models for practice. Tibbs saw something in Betty that no one else had seen. He didn't just see a pretty girl in a bikini. He saw a quality of light. He saw a natural, unforced charisma that the camera loved. He asked if he could take her picture. Betty, pragmatic and in need of money, agreed. That chance encounter changed the visual history of the 20th century. Tibbs became her first mentor. He was the one who looked at her high forehead and made the suggestion that would define her silhouette forever. "You have a high forehead," he told her. "Why don't you try bangs?" Betty went home, took a pair of scissors, and cut. When she looked in the mirror, the transformation was complete. The bangs framed her face, drawing attention to her blue eyes and her cheekbones. They gave her a look that was distinct, modern, and slightly aggressive. She was no longer Betty May from Nashville. She was Bettie Page of New York. Tibbs introduced her to the world of camera clubs. These clubs were a curious subculture. On the surface, they were artistic gatherings. In reality, they were a loophole in the censorship laws. Men could photograph women in various states of undress as long as it was for educational or artistic purposes. Betty thrived in this environment. Unlike the other models, who were stiff or visibly uncomfortable, Betty was alive. She treated the camera like a dance partner. She improvised, she laughed, she climbed trees, she made faces, she brought a sense of joy to pinup that had never existed before. Before Betty, pinup was often static and overly posed. Betty introduced movement. She introduced the idea that the woman in the picture was having fun, that she was complicit in the fantasy, not just a passive object. She was creating a new archetype, the girl who was alluring not because she was trying to entice you, but because she was simply unapologetically herself. But the camera clubs were just the minor leagues. Betty was about to be discovered by the people who would turn her image into an industry. She was about to meet the siblings who ran the dark underbelly of the New York modeling world, the people who would make her a legend and ultimately help destroy her. If Jerry Tibbs gave Bettie Page her look, Irving and Paula Claw gave her a kingdom, albeit a dark and complicated one. In the early 1950s, the epicenter of America's underground fetish industry was not a dungeon in a hidden castle, but a dusty, cluttered office in Manhattan known as Movie Star News. It was run by the Claw siblings, a pair of business-savvy opportunists who had realized that while America publicly preached Puritanism, privately, it was starving for something else. They sold movie stills and pinups, but their most lucrative trade was under-the-counter specialty photos. Betty walked into their studio and changed the trajectory of the industry. Irving Claw looked at Betty and saw a paradox that he could monetize. She had the body of a vixen, curvaceous, athletic, unashamed, but the face of a cherub. It was this juxtaposition that made her the perfect canvas for the Claw empire. From 1952 to 1957, Bettie Page became the hardest working woman in the modeling world. This was not the glamorous life of a Vogue model sipping champagne in Paris. This was factory work. The Claw studio was a mill. Betty would arrive in the morning and shoot hundreds of photos in a single day. The sets were cheap, cardboard cutouts, fake dungeon walls, random props from costume shops. It was here that the Dark Angel persona was born. Irving Claw introduced themes of bondage, domination, and submission into the shoots. In the conservative 1950s, these images were explosive. They were illegal in many states, distributed through mail-order catalogs with discreet packaging. But Betty approached them with a disarming innocence. When she was tied up, she didn't look victimized. She looked like she was waiting for the punchline of a joke. When she held a whip, she didn't look cruel. She looked like a mischievous schoolgirl playing dress-up. This is a crucial psychological detail. Betty's dissociation protected her. She viewed these shoots as acting exercises. Drawing on her theater background, she treated the bondage gear as mere props. To her, posing in 6-inch heels with a gag in her mouth was no different than wearing a costume for a Shakespeare play. She was quoted as saying, "I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. I wasn't hurting anyone." However, the sheer volume of her output during this time is staggering. She was everywhere. She was the queen of curves, the pinup of the world. But while she was becoming the fantasy of millions of men, her own reality was grindingly lonely. She was paid a pittance compared to the fortune the Claws were making off her image. She lived frugally, saving her money, still dreaming of a respectable life that seemed to be moving further and further out of reach with every click of the shutter. If the Claw studio represented the dark, urban, industrial side of Betty's career, her collaboration with Bunny Yeager represented the light. In 1954, Betty took a trip to Miami, Florida. There she met Bunny Yeager, a former model turned photographer. This partnership was significant because it was one of the few times Betty was photographed by a woman. The difference in the images is palpable. Under Yeager's lens, Betty wasn't a fetish object or a caricature. She was a vibrant, healthy, glowing woman. Yeager captured the now iconic Jungle Betty series at the Africa USA Park in Boca Raton. These images, featuring Betty in a leopard print bikini posing with real cheetahs, are perhaps the most famous pinup photos ever taken. There is a fearlessness in Betty's eyes as she stands next to the wild animals. It was a metaphor for her life, a beautiful woman standing comfortably next to danger, unafraid of the teeth and claws. It was Bunny Yeager who sent a photo of Betty to a young publisher named Hugh Hefner in Chicago. Hefner was just starting a magazine called Playboy. He was looking for a girl to grace the centerfold, of his January 1955 issue. When he saw Betty, he knew he had found her. The photo Yeager submitted was simple: Betty, kneeling, wearing nothing but a Santa hat and a playful wink. It was cheeky, festive, and undeniably irresistible. When that issue hit the newsstands, Bettie Page officially crossed over from the underground to the mainstream. She was no longer just a secret for the raincoat crowd. She was Miss January. For a brief moment in 1955, Bettie Page was on top of the world. She was famous, she was working constantly, and she was independent. But the tectonic plates of American culture were shifting, and an earthquake was coming that would swallow her whole. To understand why Bettie Page vanished, you have to understand the climate of fear that gripped America in the mid-1950s. This was the era of McCarthyism, where everyone was looking for communists under their beds. But parallel to the Red Scare was a moral scare. Politicians looking for easy votes began a crusade against filth and juvenile delinquency. Enter Senator Estes Kefauver. Kefauver was a Democrat from Tennessee, ironically Betty's home state. He launched a series of Senate hearings investigating the link between obscenity and crime. He needed a villain. He needed a face to put on the moral decay of the nation. He found Irving Klaw, and by extension he found Bettie Page. The federal government descended on the Klaw studio. They raided the offices, seizing negatives and burning films. They hauled Irving Klaw before the Senate subcommittee. While Betty was never criminally charged, she was summoned to testify, though she was never actually called to the stand. The psychological impact of this on Betty was catastrophic. Remember, beneath the leather and lace, she was still the girl from the Bible Belt who wanted to be a teacher. She was still the woman who desperately craved approval. Now the United States government was effectively labeling her work, her life, as a cancer on society. The media began to paint the pinup industry as a ring of perversion. Betty felt the walls closing in. The acting excuse no longer worked. She saw herself through the eyes of the Senate, a sinner, a corrupter of youth. The shame that had been planted by her father's trauma and watered by her religious upbringing began to bloom into a toxic flower of self-loathing. The Klaws closed their shop under legal pressure, destroying the vast majority of their negatives to avoid prosecution. The factory was shut down. Betty's income stream evaporated, but worse, her sense of safety was shattered. She felt watched. She felt judged. The fun was over. By 1957, at the age of 34, Bettie Page was exhausted. The joyful energy that had defined her photos was fading. She felt old in an industry obsessed with youth. She felt dirty in a country obsessed with purity. She decided to run again. Just as she had fled Nashville for New York, she now fled New York for Florida. She wanted to wash the city off her skin. She attempted to build a normal life. She married for a second time to a man named Armin Walterson. This marriage was another disaster. It was a chaotic union marked by arguments and instability. But it was during this time, living in Key West in 1959, that the final break occurred. Betty, depressed and adrift, wandered into a local church. The service was evangelical, emotional, and fiery. As she sat in the pew, something snapped in her mind. She later described having a mystical experience. She claimed to see a vision of the cross. She felt the Holy Spirit descend upon her. To a psychiatrist, this might have been the first sign of the schizophrenia that would later consume her, a manic episode triggered by extreme stress and trauma. To Betty, it was salvation. She was born again. The conversion was absolute and violent. She didn't just embrace Christianity, she weaponized it against her past. She looked at her career, the thousands of photos, the films, the magazine covers, and saw only sin. She felt a crushing weight of guilt. She believed she had led men astray. She believed she was destined for hell unless she repented. And so she committed the ultimate act of self-erasure. She broke ties with everyone from her former life. She stopped modeling immediately. She demanded that photographers stop selling her images, a request that was largely ignored. She divorced her husband and moved back to Nashville, then to other cities, drifting like a ghost. When people recognized her on the street and asked, "Are you Bettie Page?" she would look them in the eye and say, "No, you're mistaken." She wasn't lying. In her mind, Bettie Page, the pinup queen, was dead. She had killed her to save her soul. The years from 1960 to 1979 are often glossed over in biographies as the quiet years. In reality, they were a slow-motion horror movie. Bettie tried to live the life she thought she was supposed to have. She worked as a school teacher for a brief time but was fired. She worked as a secretary. She lived in poverty, relying on the kindness of strangers and the meager wages of menial jobs. But the brain is a fragile organ. The untreated trauma of her childhood incest, combined with the stress of her public shaming and the genetic predisposition to mental illness, began to erode her grip on reality. The voices started as whispers and grew into shouts. She began to believe she was being followed. She believed there was a conspiracy against her. Her religious devotion morphed into religious fanaticism. She spent hours, days reading the Bible, looking for codes and secret messages. She moved to California in the late 1970s, living in a small, run-down apartment in Southern California. She was unrecognizable. The jet black hair was graying. The famous figure was hidden under shapeless clothes. She was just another eccentric lady in a city full of them. But the violence inside her was building. The rage she had suppressed for 50 years, the rage at her father, at her husbands, at the men who used her, at the government who shamed her, was looking for a target. In 1972, her third marriage to Harry Lear crumbled. By the late 70s, she was living alone, isolating herself from her siblings. The paranoia became suffocating. She believed her landlord was stealing from her. She believed people were trying to poison her. And then came the night of the knives. On a warm spring day in April 1979, the tension finally broke. Bettie was living in a shared house. She had been arguing with her landlady, an elderly woman. The details of the incident are tragic and brutal. Bettie, in the grip of a full-blown psychotic break, convinced that she was acting on divine orders to purge evil, attacked her landlady. It was a violent, bloody altercation involving a knife. The police arrived to find a scene of chaos. When they handcuffed the perpetrator, they didn't know they were arresting the most famous pinup model in history. They saw a confused, ranting woman in her late 50s, citing scripture and talking about demons. Bettie was charged with attempted murder. However, the court psychiatrist quickly realized that this was not a crime of malice, but a crime of illness. She was diagnosed with acute paranoid schizophrenia. The verdict was not guilty by reason of insanity. Bettie Page, the woman who had once winked at the world from the cover of Playboy, was committed to the Patton State Hospital. This was not a spa. It was a high-security psychiatric institution for the criminally insane. She would spend the next decade of her life behind those walls. While she was medicated and walking the sterile hallways of the asylum, a strange phenomenon was happening in the outside world. A revival was beginning. New generations of artists, punk rockers, and feminists were rediscovering her photos in thrift stores and old magazines. They didn't know she was locked away. They didn't know she was suffering. To them, she was cool, retro, and mysterious. The cult of Bettie was being born at the exact moment the real Bettie was at her lowest point. The irony was total. The world was falling in love with her ghost, while the woman herself was erasing her own existence, day by medicated day. when the heavy steel doors of Patton State Hospital slammed shut behind Bettie Page in 1979. They didn't just lock a person in, they locked a legend out. Patton State is not a place of glamour. It is a warehouse for the broken souls of California, a sprawling complex of sterile hallways, fluorescent lights, and the pervasive smell of industrial, cleaner, and despair. For the next 10 years, the woman who had once frolicked with cheetahs and winked for Playboy lived in a world stripped of all color. Inside the hospital, she was not Bettie Page, the queen of curves. She was just a patient. Her medical files listed her diagnosis, paranoid schizophrenia. The treatment in the late 1970s and early 80s was blunt and heavy-handed. She was subjected to a regimen of powerful antipsychotic medications, drugs like Thorazine and Haldol, that quelled the voices in her head, but also flattened her affect, slowed her movements, and dulled the sparkle in her eyes. The chemical straitjacket brought her peace, but at the cost of her vitality. There is a profound and heartbreaking irony in this decade of her life. Outside those walls, the 1980s were exploding with excess neon and a new wave of liberation. But inside, Bettie was living the life of a nun. She attended group therapy. She ate cafeteria food on plastic trays. She aged. Her hair, once the jet black mane that defined a generation, turned silver and was chopped short for convenience. Her figure, once the perfect dimensions of 36, 26, 36, softened and expanded under the weight of medication and inactivity. She kept her past a secret from the other patients and the staff. Occasionally, a doctor or nurse might look at her file, see the name Bettie Page, and feel a flicker of recognition, but they would dismiss it. Surely, that Bettie Page couldn't be this quiet, grandmotherly woman muttering prayers in the common room. During these lost years, Bettie retreated further into religion, but unlike the manic, violent religiosity that led to her breakdown, this was a quieter, desperate faith. She read the Bible for hours every day. She believed that her incarceration was God's will, a penance for the sins of her modeling years. She was doing time not just for the stole her innocence on her landlady, but in her mind, for the millions of lustful thoughts she had inspired. She was serving a sentence for being beautiful. She was eventually released from Patton State, only to be monitored in a halfway house. But the demons weren't done. In 1982, she was arrested again for another violent outburst, another knife incident driven by paranoia. She was sent back. The cycle seemed endless. It appeared certain that Bettie Page would die in custody, an anonymous statistic in the state mental health system. While Bettie was sitting in the day room of a mental ward watching a staticky television, a strange phenomenon was occurring in the outside world. She was becoming famous again. The revival didn't start on Madison Avenue. It started in the underground, much like her original career. In the early 1980s, a new subculture was forming, psychobilly, a mix of punk rock and 1950s rockabilly. Bands like the Cramps and the Misfits were looking for an aesthetic that was dangerous, provocative, and retro. They found Bettie Page. To the punk rockers, Bettie wasn't just a pinup. She was a rebel. She looked tough. She looked like she could handle herself in a mosh pit. Her image began to appear on album covers, on leather jackets, on fanzines, Xeroxed in basements. She became the patron saint of the alternative scene, but the true architect of her resurrection was a comic book artist named Dave Stevens. In 1982, Stevens created a comic book called The Rocketeer. He needed a girlfriend for his hero, a character who was sweet but undeniably irresistible. He based the character Bettie entirely on Bettie Page. He drew her with loving detail, the bangs, the curves, the attitude. The Rocketeer became a cult hit, and readers began writing to Stevens asking, "Is this character real?" Who is she? Stevens, a lifelong fan, began a quest to find the real Bettie Page. He wanted to pay her. He wanted to give her credit. He hired private investigators. He scoured phone books. But Bettie had done too good a job of disappearing. The trail was cold. Rumors swirled. She was dead. She was a nun in a convent. She was living in Europe. She had married a millionaire. No one guessed she was in a state hospital in San Bernardino. As the 80s wore on, the Bettie boom exploded. Merchandise began to appear, calendars, postcards, t-shirts. A new generation of women who rejected the stick-thin supermodel aesthetic of the time looked at Bettie's athletic, curvy body and saw a more attainable and powerful version of beauty. But here is the cruelest economic twist of the story. Bettie didn't see a dime. Copyright law regarding photography is tricky. Generally, the photographer owns the image, not the model. Irving Klaw and his sister Paula had sold or lost the rights to various entities. Bootleggers were printing Bettie's face on everything from coffee mugs to shower curtains. Millions of dollars were changing hands. The image of Bettie Page was generating a GDP larger than some small nations, while the woman herself was living on a state allowance of less than $50 a month, unable to afford a new pair of shoes. In 1992, Bettie was finally released from the supervision of the state. She was 69 years old. She was deemed cured, or at least manageable. She moved into a small group home in Los Angeles. She lived in poverty, driving a beat-up 1972 Ford Pinto that was constantly breaking down. She lived a life of extreme anonymity. She went to church. She watched AMC movies. She argued with her landlords about the rent. But the secret couldn't hold forever. The hunt for Bettie Page had reached a fever pitch. In the early 90s, lifestyles of the rich and famous, ironically, and other tabloid shows began offering rewards for information on her whereabouts. The pressure was mounting. Dave Stevens, who had never given up, finally got a lead. He didn't want to expose her. He wanted to help her. When Stevens and a few trusted contacts finally reached out to her, Bettie was terrified. She thought the police were coming back. She thought the government was going to revoke her Social Security. When they told her, "Bettie, you're famous. People love you," she looked at them with genuine confusion. "Famous for what?" she asked. "I haven't posed in 35 years. She had no concept of camp or retro. She didn't understand that her photos had transcended obscenity to become art. To her, they were just silly pictures she took for money when she was young. Slowly, cautiously, she allowed a few people into her life. Dave Stevens became a close friend and protector. He showed her the comic books. He showed her the magazines. He explained that she was an icon. But then the media wolves arrived. In 1993, the press located her. A camera crew ambushed her outside her home. The footage is heartbreaking. It shows an elderly woman, heavy-set, wearing thick glasses and a shapeless dress, shielding her face with her purse, crying out, "Leave me alone. I'm not her. I'm not her." It was a violation. The public wanted the fantasy. They wanted the 28-year-old in the leopard print. They didn't want the 70-year-old mental health survivor. Bettie knew this. Her vanity, which had laid dormant for decades, roared back to life. She made a vow. She would never allow herself to be photographed again. She would not destroy the illusion. Once she was outed, Bettie faced a choice. Continue to hide and let strangers profit off her legacy, or step into the light and take control. She was broke. She was living on Social Security checks that barely covered rent. She had medical bills. The pragmatism that had served her in the 1950s kicked in again. If people were going to sell her face, she might as well get paid for it. With the help of legal counsel and new management, CMG Worldwide, Bettie began the arduous process of reclaiming her rights. This was a legal battlefield. Since many of the original negatives had been destroyed or sold without contracts, establishing ownership was a nightmare. However, the growing concept of right of publicity, the idea that a person owns their own likeness, worked in her favor. Her lawyers began sending cease and desist letters. They began licensing official merchandise. For the first time in 40 years, a check arrived in the mail with Bettie's name on it that wasn't from the government. But Bettie remained a recluse. She refused to do on-camera interviews. She refused to make public appearances. She agreed to do audio interviews only. Her voice, still thick with the southern drawl of Nashville, became her only connection to the fans. In these interviews, we hear the real Bettie. She is feisty. She is funny. She is surprisingly sharp. She talks about her modeling days not with shame. The religious guilt had softened somewhat with age and financial security, but with a workmanlike detachment. She talks about making costumes. She talks about the photographers, but she also reveals the scars. When asked about relationships, she is cynical. Men are only after one thing, she would say. She never remarried. She never had children. The trauma of her father and the failures of her husbands had cemented a wall around her heart that no amount of late life fame could breach. There is one moment in her late life that feels like a scene from a movie. In the late 1990s, Hugh Hefner, the man whose magazine had launched her into the stratosphere, invited her to the Playboy Mansion. Bettie hesitated. The mansion represented everything she had fled from, the hedonism, the sin. But she also knew that Hefner had always spoken of her with respect. He had sent her money when he found out she was struggling, even before she signed with an agent. She agreed to go, but on her terms. No cameras, no press. A car picked her up. When she arrived at the legendary Gothic Tudor mansion in Holmby Hills, the staff was lined up to meet her. These were people who had posters of her on their walls. When the car door opened and an elderly woman with a cane stepped out, there was a hushed silence. Hefner approached her. He didn't see the age. He took her hand and kissed it. "My dear," he said, "you are the most beautiful woman who ever lived." They had tea. They talked about the old days, about the innocent era of the 1950s, before the world grew cynical. For a few hours, Bettie wasn't the crazy lady from the asylum. She was the queen. She left the mansion that day with her head held high. It was a moment of closure. The industry that had used her, discarded her, and then mythologized her was finally bowing to her. But closure is not a cure. The money was coming in now, hundreds of thousands of dollars. She could afford a better apartment. She could afford nice clothes, though she still shopped at discount stores out of habit. She could afford the best doctors. But you cannot buy back time. You cannot buy back the decade lost to the mental ward. You cannot buy back the children you never had. As the new millennium dawned, Bettie Page was rich, famous, and beloved, but she was also dying. As the new millennium dawned, Bettie Page settled into a rhythm of life that was as quiet as her youth had been loud. She was living in a modest apartment in Los Angeles, surrounded by books, religious tapes, and the memories of a life she still struggled to fully integrate. The legal victories of the 1990s had secured her financial future. For the first time in her life, Bettie did not have to worry about where her next meal was coming from. But money could not repair the physical toll of 80 years of stress, poverty, and mental illness. Her health began to fail. She suffered from arthritis, ulcers, and a heart condition. Yet her mind, once her greatest enemy, had found a fragile peace. In her audio interviews from this period, we hear a woman who has come to terms with her strange destiny. She often spoke of her fans with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. She couldn't understand why young girls with tattoos of her face would write her letters saying she had saved them. "I didn't save anyone," she would say. "Only Jesus saves." But she answered the letters. She signed the photos, always signing "Love Betty," never just Bettie Page, reclaiming her humanity in the autograph. However, she remained steadfast in her refusal to be seen. When the biopic The Notorious Bettie Page was released in 2005, starring Gretchen Mol, the world turned its eyes to Betty again. The filmmakers tried to involve her. Betty watched the film, or at least parts of it. Her reaction was telling. She didn't like it. She felt it focused too much on the dark years with the claws, the bondage, the trials, the sadness. "That wasn't the whole story," she reportedly said. "We had fun. We laughed." Even at the end, Betty was trying to protect the joy. She wanted to be remembered for the sunshine in Miami, not the gloom of the New York studio. She wanted to be the girl winking in the Santa hat, not the woman testifying before the Senate. Her reclusion became her final performance. By refusing to show her aged face, she preserved the immortality of her youth. She understood, perhaps instinctively, that the public could not handle the reality of Bettie Page as an octogenarian. They needed the icon to be frozen in 1955. So she gave them what they wanted. She sacrificed her present visibility to secure her past glory. In early December 2008, Betty suffered a heart attack. She was rushed to a hospital in Los Angeles. Complications set in quickly. Pneumonia, the old man's friend but the weak heart's enemy, took hold. She lay in a coma for several days. Word leaked to the press that the Queen was fading. Outside the hospital, the world continued to spin, a world that was now filled with Betty Bangs, rockabilly festivals, and high-fashion magazines copying her style. But inside the room, it was just an elderly woman fighting for breath one last time. Her brother, Jack Page, was by her side. The family that had been fractured by poverty, divorce, and distance had, in these final moments, found a way back to each other. On December 11th, 2008, Bettie Page passed away. She was 85 years old. The news broke instantly. It wasn't just reported in the tabloids. It was on the front page of the New York Times. The BBC, CNN, and news outlets in Tokyo and Paris covered it. The world mourned her not as a former porn star, but as a cultural titan. Hugh Hefner released a statement. She was a remarkable lady, an iconic figure in pop culture who influenced modern femininity, taste in fashion, and posed for photos that will be remembered forever. But the most poignant tributes came from the fans. In internet forums, on MySpace pages, which were popular at the time, and in tattoo parlors, people lit virtual candles. They posted the same images over and over. Betty on the beach, Betty in the leopard print, Betty smiling. She was buried at the Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery in Los Angeles. It is a fitting resting place. She lies just a few steps away from Marilyn Monroe. In life, they were the two poles of American desire. Marilyn was the tragic, blonde vulnerability. Betty was the playful, dark resilience. In death, they are neighbors. But Bettie Page's life had ended. Her myth was just being born. Usually, when a celebrity dies, the story fades into silence. With Betty, the silence was shattered by a gold rush. Because she died without children, a power vacuum opened up that transformed her name from a person into a battlefield. Suddenly, the woman who had spent the last 40 years of her life living in near poverty, reading the Bible and repenting for her sinful past, was resurrected as a global empire of hedonism. You could buy Bettie Page wine, visit Bettie Page boutiques in Las Vegas, and gamble on Bettie Page slot machines. There is a deep, uncomfortable irony here. The commodification was total. The nuance of her life, the trauma, the intelligence, the mental illness was scrubbed away to sell handbags and lingerie. turning a complex survivor into a cartoon character. But the most fascinating battle wasn't for her money, it was for her meaning. Feminists who had once decried pinup as objectification began to reclaim Bettie as a pioneer of body liberation. She became the patron saint of a new kind of power, athletic, unashamed, and in control. The conservative Christian lady might have been baffled by this, but art no longer belongs to the artist once it is released. The audience decided she was a hero. Why Bettie? Why not the thousands of other pinup girls from the 40s and 50s? Why has her face endured while others faded into the dustbins of antique stores? The answer lies in the smile. Look at a photo of Marilyn Monroe. There is often a sadness behind the eyes, a plea for love. Look at a photo of Sophia Loren. There is an intimidating, regal distance. Now look at Bettie. She is looking right at you, and she is grinning. It's not a seductive, heavy-lidded, come hither look. It's a conspiratorial grin. It says, isn't this silly? Isn't this fun? I know I'm naked and I don't care, and neither should you. She dissolved the shame. In a country that has always been deeply conflicted about desire, torn between Puritanism and the explicit, Bettie Page offered a third way. She offered joy. She made desire feel healthy. She made kink feel approachable. Furthermore, her dark angel aesthetic, the black bangs, the blue eyes, the pale skin, created a graphic visual that is timeless. It looks as modern today as it did in 1950. It transcends eras. But the deepest reason for her endurance is the tragedy we have just explored. We love a survivor. We are drawn to the contrast between the sunny image and the shadowy life. Knowing what she survived, the incest, the trauma, the madness, the asylum, adds a layer of profound gravity to those light-hearted photos. When we see her laughing on the beach in 1955, we aren't just seeing a model, we are seeing a woman claiming a moment of happiness in a life designed to crush her. Bettie Page was the figure of what might have been. She might have been a teacher. She might have been a mother. She might have been a movie star. But the cruelty of her circumstances, the poverty of the depression, the violence of her father, the chemical imbalance of her own brain, robbed her of those ordinary paths. Instead, she became something else. She became a dream. Her existence forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. We devoured her fantasy, while the woman herself starved for sanity. We celebrated her freedom, while she was locked in a cage. We turned her into a goddess, but we failed to protect her as a human being. And yet, Bettie Page won. She survived the trauma. She survived the Senate hearings. She survived the voices in her head. She survived the poverty. She outlived her tormentors, her critics, and her exploiters. She died in her bed, known and loved, having reconciled with her family and her God. If you walk past a shop window today and see that familiar silhouette, the bangs, the curves, the attitude, do not just see a pinup. See a warrior. See the girl from Nashville who took the pain of her life and transmuted it into a smile that will never, ever die. Bettie Page has left the building. But the show? The show will go on forever.